They told everyone the house was theirs. But how would you react if you saw your parents live streaming a party in the $1.5 million home you bought for them, pretending you didn't exist? I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I parked down the street, walked straight in, and stopped the music. In front of 120 guests, I said one line, "This is my house." And that was the night the lies finally collapsed. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The sun in Santa Barbara was already hot enough to sting my neck when I heard my mother's voice slice through the quiet morning. "Emily, hurry up with those leaves. Samantha's friends will be here any minute." I kept sweeping the dry brush of the broom against the patio bricks, drowning out her irritation. I was 15, and by then I had already learned that when my mother spoke that way, the safest answer was silence. The palm trees swayed above the air, smelled faintly of bleach and jasmine, my mother's favorite combination. She appeared at the doorway wearing a fitted cream dress and heels, even though she wasn't going anywhere. Her hair was curled, makeup done. She always said, "You never know who might stop by." Her husband, my father, Robert Carter, sat inside reading the paper, muttering about the stock market. I was just another piece of furniture in that house, something useful when needed, invisible the rest of the time. When Samantha's friends arrived, they burst through the gate like a gust of perfume and laughter. My sister, 10 years older, floated out in a sundress. "Thanks, Mom," she said, kissing Linda on the cheek. "Everything looks amazing." Mom beamed. "Only the best for you, sweetheart." No one looked at me, standing by the broom dust, clinging to my sneakers. That night, at dinner, the table glowed under the chandelier, the smell of roast chicken filling the air. Linda talked about Samantha being invited to the student council, and Dad nodded proudly, carving the meat. "That's leadership potential right there," he said. I waited for someone to ask about my grades, about how I'd just aced my algebra test, but the conversation never turned. Finally, I got an A on my math exam. Mom didn't even look up. "That's nice, dear. Just stay out of trouble and keep your room clean." I chewed in silence, the tick of the clock loud in the background. After dinner, while washing dishes, I heard Dad's voice through the half-closed door to the den. "We shouldn't have had another one, Linda," he said quietly. "It was too much." Too late. My hands froze in the soapy water. I didn't move until I heard the news playing on the TV, and knew they'd stopped talking about me. Later that night, I sat on the floor of my room and stared at the few photographs on the wall. In every family picture, Samantha was centered, laughing, perfect. I was either half cut out or standing in the background like I'd wandered into someone else's life. At school, I didn't tell anyone about home. I let them think I came from a normal family. But I spent most afternoons with my grandparents. Grandma always had lemon cookies cooling on the counter, and Grandpa would pick me up from school in his old Ford, calling me Sunshine. They lived 10 miles away, but it felt like a different universe. One where I mattered. He'd say, "When you feel like no one wants you, remember that's when you prove you belong." I used to nod, pretending to believe it. The summer I turned 16, my grandparents' health started failing. Grandpa's hands trembled when he tried to pour his coffee, and Grandma forgot where she put her glasses. I began staying home more, helping my mother, though she never asked. One evening I set the table for dinner, 4 plates as always. Samantha wasn't home much anymore, spending nights at friends' houses, or with her new boyfriend. When she did show up, Mom lit up like it was Christmas. That night, Mom poured herself a glass of wine and said almost casually, "We need to talk about college." I looked up, hopeful. "Okay." She didn't smile. "We can't afford to pay for both you and Samantha. Your sister's degree is almost done, and she needs our help finishing. You understand that, don't you?" I swallowed hard. "But I could get a scholarship. I've been applying." Dad interrupted, his tone firm. "Emily, let's be realistic. Samantha has a clear path ahead of her. You're still figuring things out." It was quiet after that, the kind of quiet that presses on your chest. I stared at the tablecloth, tracing the embroidered edge with my finger, until Mom said, "You'll be fine. You always land on your feet." That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint laughter from the TV downstairs. The moonlight crept across my room, lighting up the broom I'd left by the wall after sweeping the patio. In that moment, I made myself a promise. One day, I'd leave this house. I'd leave their pity, their indifference, and the smallness they'd wrapped around me, like a blanket I never asked for. I'd build something so odd they couldn't ignore it even if they wanted to. And when I did, I'd never come back. The envelope came on a Thursday morning in late spring, thick and heavy with the Stanford crest printed in red. I held it in both hands, feeling my heart beat through the paper. For a second, I just stared at it on the kitchen table, afraid to open it, afraid it might not be what I'd been praying for. My mother walked in still in her robe, hair perfectly curled. "You're going to be late for school," she said, pouring coffee. "I got something from Stanford," I said quietly. She looked over her cup. "Well, open it. Don't just stand there." The letter trembled in my hands as I unfolded it. "Congratulations," was the first word I saw. I read the next line out loud, my voice catching. "You've been awarded a full scholarship for the School of Business and Finance." My mother blinked, then smiled. Small and polite, the kind of smile she gave to strangers. "That's nice, honey. Just don't expect us to help with extra expenses. You'll have to figure those out yourself." My father lowered his newspaper long enough to say, "Don't come back here with empty hands." Then he flipped the page as if the conversation was done. That night, I packed my bags in the small room at the end of the hall. The window was cracked open and the ocean air drifted in. I folded my clothes carefully, even though most of them were hand-me-downs. I packed my notebooks, the photo of my grandparents, and a cheap alarm clock that always ran 5 minutes fast. No one came to the door to say goodbye. The next morning, I dragged my suitcase onto the bus headed north. Santa Barbara's morning fog rolled past the window like smoke, softening the edges of the houses as the town disappeared behind me. I didn't cry. I just pressed my forehead to the glass and whispered to myself, "Keep moving." Stanford was bigger, colder, sharper than I imagined. The dorm rooms smelled like old carpet and ambition. My roommate came from Boston and had a father who owned a bank. She talked about vacations in Europe the way I talked about bus routes. I worked nights at the campus cafe, steaming milk for people who didn't look me in the eye, and mornings in the library shelving books until my arms ached. I barely slept. Sometimes I'd pass out over a stack of economics textbooks, wake up with pencil marks on my cheek, and laugh quietly to myself. That's where I met Eleanor Brooks. She was in her 70s, short, white hair, always wearing a silk scarf that smelled faintly of lavender. She came to the library every Tuesday, sat in the same chair by the window, and read the Wall Street Journal with a magnifying glass. One morning, she dropped her folder papers scattering everywhere. I knelt to help her. She smiled. "You're the only one who still bothers to pick things up for an old woman." "You're not that old," I said. "Old enough to know brilliance when I see it." She pointed to my notes. "You organize these better than some of my graduate assistants used to." We started talking after that. She told me she used to teach economics back in the 70s, before women were taken seriously in boardrooms. "They called me the numbers lady," she said once. I called them idiots. I laughed. She grinned, eyes sharp as glass. "Don't ever let where you come from define what you're worth, Emily. They'll try. They always try." That night, I wrote in my journal, "Work harder. Be undeniable." The weeks turned into semesters. The library became my second home. Coffee my bloodstream. I sent my parents postcards every few months, short ones. They never wrote back. Sometimes I'd see families visiting the campus, mothers taking photos, fathers carrying boxes of care packages. I told myself I didn't need that. But there were nights when I'd sit under the courtyard lights, watching them leave, and feel the emptiness press against my ribs, Eleanor noticed. "You can't build walls so high you can't see the sky," she told me once. "You deserve more than survival." I smiled, though I didn't believe her yet. By my junior year, Eleanor had become my anchor. When she fell and fractured her hip, I visited her at the rehab center every week. She'd scold me for skipping study groups. "Don't you dare throw away that brain of yours to keep me company." "I'm not," I said. "You're my study break." She laughed softly. "You remind me of myself at your age. Too smart to stay quiet, too scared to speak up." When I graduated in 2014, she was there in the front row, bundled in a bright blue shawl. I searched the crowd for my parents anyway, even though I already knew they wouldn't come. The empty space where they should have been felt heavier than any seat. When they called my name, I walked across the stage to polite applause. My shoes clicked against the wood, my diploma warm in my hand. The dean shook it and said, "Congratulations, Ms. Carter." For a moment, I just stood there looking at the rows of families clapping for their children. I smiled through tears that came before I could stop them. Under my breath, I whispered, "I made it." When the ceremony ended, Eleanor hugged me tight. "You're free now," she said. But as I looked out over the Stanford courtyard, sunlight bouncing off the stone arches, I knew freedom wasn't enough. I didn't just want to leave my past behind. I wanted to build something so unshakable that even my parents would have to see it. New York in winter felt like glass and steel and noise that never slept. The first time I walked into Horizon Capital's lobby, the marble floors were so polished I could see my own reflection. Everyone there moved like they were late for something important. The women wore heels that clicked like seconds on a clock, and the men smelled like expensive coffee and ambition. My name tag said E. Carter, analyst. The receptionist barely looked up when she handed me my ID card. I straightened my jacket, took a breath, and rode the elevator to the 32nd floor. On my first day, a man about my age leaned against my cubicle and smirked. Carter, huh? You're not related to the Carters in Santa Barbara, are you? I heard that family went broke after the housing crash. I looked up at him calm. I'm a Carter who pays her own bills, I said, and turned back to my computer. He laughed under his breath. Feisty. You'll need that around here. The office was all open glass and sharp edges, no place to hide, no room for mistakes. That morning, the CEO, Michael Torres, gave a welcome speech to the new analysts. He was in his 40s, tall silver streak in his hair, the kind of man who spoke like every word was a test. I don't hire people because they're smart, he said. I hire people who can fail and come back stronger. If you can't take pressure leave now. No one moved. I gripped my pen tighter. The first few months were a blur of spreadsheets, late nights, and takeout boxes. I'd stay until the janitors started vacuuming, rereading the same datasets, until my eyes burned. The city outside the windows glittered indifferent. I was determined to make that indifference notice me. One night while the floor was empty, I heard footsteps behind me. You're still here, a voice asked. I turned. It was Jordan Lee, one of the firm's in-house attorneys. Early 30s, sleeves, rolled up, tired eyes, but kind. Trying to make sure I don't mess up the quarterly report, I said. He smiled. You'll burn out before you get promoted. Maybe I said, but at least I'll burn out moving upward. He laughed softly. Fair point. From that night, we talked more. He explained contract law in simple terms, showed me how to read financial clauses that could ruin a deal if overlooked. Sometimes we'd share coffee in the break room at midnight, joking about how we should put our names on the mugs since no one else worked that late. You ever think about taking a weekend off, he asked once. I shrugged. I spent too much time invisible growing up. I'm not wasting visibility now. He didn't ask more after that. Months passed. I earned small wins. One presentation praised one client happy, but nothing big enough to mean safety. My mother called every few weeks. The conversations were always the same. How are you, Emily? She'd ask. I'm fine, Mom. Working a lot. Well, Samantha's doing great. She's modeling for a local brand now, can you believe it? Her picture's in the paper. That's nice, I'd say, staring at my laptop screen. Mom's voice softened, almost patronizing. I just hope you're not too lonely out there. I smiled even though she couldn't see it. I have work. Work didn't talk back. Work didn't lie. In late 2016, a rumor started spreading around the office. A risky investment fund, our biggest one, had collapsed overseas. Millions were gone. Overnight, the hallways filled with whispers. By morning, the panic was official. Horizon Capital was bleeding money. Executives yelled in glass rooms. Analysts scrambled to justify numbers that no longer made sense. Michael Torres called an emergency meeting. Either we find a solution in 72 hours, he said, or we start layoffs. I stayed 3 nights straight, sleeping in my chair, fueled by caffeine and fear. On the 4th dawn, an idea hit me. What if we redirected part of our remaining portfolio into sustainable energy investments? The government incentives could offset losses. It was a long shot, but long shots were all we had. When I presented the plan, my hands were shaking. Michael stood at the head of the table, unreadable. You're proposing to pivot an entire division. Yes, I said. We've been clinging to dead money. We need to move where growth still exists. For a moment, silence. Then someone muttered. It's insane, maybe I said, but not as insane as going bankrupt pretending we're fine. Michael's jaw tightened. Leave the projections on my desk. That night, I walked home through falling snow, certain I'd just ended my career. But the next morning, an email went out. Effective immediately. Horizon Capital will shift 20% of its assets toward renewable investment per Carter's proposal. By the end of the quarter, losses slowed, then stopped. A month later, profits began to climb again. Michael called me into his office. You realize you just saved this company, he said. I tried to joke. Maybe I just delayed disaster. He smiled faintly. Either way, well done. Don't get comfortable. I stepped out, my legs weak, the weight of exhaustion turning into something like pride. That evening, I rode the elevator to the top floor. From the 30th story, Manhattan stretched beneath me, bridges lit like veins, the city humming with relentless life. I thought of my parents, of their perfect daughter, with her photo shoots and small-town fame. Would they even understand this world I'd built for myself? If they could see me now, I whispered, would they be proud? The answer came before I finished the thought. I didn't need them to be. I leaned against the cold glass, watching the skyline flicker, and felt something steady settle inside me. Not joy, not relief, just certainty. I was finally standing on my own 2 feet, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of falling. The call came on a Thursday night while I was still at the office. The city outside my window glowed with winter lights, the kind that made New York look softer than it really was. My phone buzzed with an unfamiliar California number. I almost ignored it, assuming it was spam, but something in my gut made me pick up. Emily. The voice was thinner than I remembered, but unmistakable. Mom. It's your father, she said, pausing. Just long enough for my heart to drop. He hasn't been feeling well. He'd like to see you. For a few seconds, I didn't say anything. I could hear the faint ticking of her grandfather clock through the line, the one that had filled every silent dinner of my childhood. Finally, I said, I'll come this weekend. There was a small exhale on her end, relief mixed with hesitation. Good. He'll be glad. I doubted that, but I didn't argue. When my flight landed at Santa Barbara Airport, the air smelled like salt and eucalyptus, just like I remembered. The cab ride to my parents' house took me past the same streets, the same houses with Christmas lights still tangled in their hedges. Everything looked familiar, but smaller, like the past had been shrinking behind my back all this time. The house hadn't aged well. Moss crawled up the driveway, the shutters were peeling, and the porch light flickered weakly. I stood there for a moment, suitcase in hand, staring at the cracked welcome mat that had never really meant the word. The door opened before I knocked. Mom stood there in a cardigan, her hair shorter now, streaked with gray. You look thin, she said, smiling a little too tightly. You look the same, I replied, because I didn't know what else to say. Inside, the air smelled like old carpet and lemon cleaner. My father sat on the couch, remote in hand, a blanket draped over his legs. His hair was white now, his shoulders smaller. He glanced up at me, eyes tired, but sharp. You came. Of course I did, I said softly. Dinner was quiet. The clatter of silverware filled the space where conversation should have been. The walls were lined with family photos. Samantha at her wedding. Samantha with her firstborn. Samantha on vacation in Maui. My face appeared only once, a grainy graduation photo tucked into the corner of a frame. Halfway through the meal, the front door opened and laughter spilled in. Samantha breezed inside glowing in a beige coat, followed by her husband Ethan, who carried 2 restless boys in matching sneakers. Surprise, she sang out. We didn't think you'd actually come. Em. Her voice hadn't changed. She kissed our mother's cheek and began unloading gift bags. We're crashing here for a few months, she said cheerfully. Ethan's between jobs and the market's been brutal. Dad nodded, trying to sound casual. They're staying until they get back on their feet. I forced a smile. That's great. As the boys darted through the living room, knocking into furniture, Samantha sighed. It's been rough. Our apartment lease ended and the bank's been calling about our mortgage. But you know we're keeping positive, Mom chimed in. Your father and I are in the same boat. The market's awful in this house. Well, it's just too much upkeep. Dad stabbed at his potatoes. We talked about selling, but no one's buying. Guess we'll just ride it out. I looked around the room. The sagging curtains, the water stains on the ceiling, the exhaustion in their faces. And for a moment, I felt something strange. Pity, maybe. Or guilt. It was hard to tell the difference anymore. I could help, I said quietly. Mom's head snapped up. Help, how Samantha laughed lightly. Oh, Em, don't worry about us. You've got your Wall Street life now. I see your company's name all over the news. You must be swimming in bonuses. I ignored the tone. I mean it. I can help. Dad frowned. We're not asking for handouts. I know, I said. But I want to. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Even the twins stopped running, sensing the tension. Finally, I took a deep breath. Let me buy you a new place. Something smaller, easier. You've both worked your whole lives. You deserve comfort. The room went still. Mom blinked her eyes glossy. Emily, we couldn't possibly. You can. I interrupted gently. I've done well. It's not charity, Mom. It's family. She covered her mouth, tears spilling past her fingers. I don't know what to say. Say yes, I told her. Dad leaned back, eyes wet but distant. You'd really do that for us? I would, I said. Consider it a thank you for everything. Even the hard parts. Mom got up and came around the table. For the first time I could remember, she hugged me. Her perfume was faint, mixed with the smell of detergent and onions. Her voice broke against my shoulder. I don't deserve this, sweetheart. I almost laughed. Maybe not, but I'm doing it anyway. When she let go, Samantha was staring at me. Wow, she said slowly. That's generous. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Guess you really made it, huh? Guess I did, I said, forcing my own smile. Later that night, I sat outside on the porch, the ocean breeze brushing my face. The sound of laughter drifted from inside. The twins, my parents, Samantha, all talking over each other. For the first time in years, I let myself believe this might be a new beginning. Maybe forgiveness was possible after all. The porch light flickered again, and I watched it steady itself before shining bright. The morning sun in Montecito shimmered off the hills, golden and soft. The kind of light that made everything look like it belonged in a real estate brochure. Jordan and I stood at the gate of the property, the sound of the ocean faint in the distance. The house in front of us gleamed white, trimmed with pale gray shutters, and framed by a wide green lawn. There was a wraparound porch, a row of hydrangeas under the windows, and a line of trees sloping down toward the canyon. Jordan shaded his eyes. 1.5 million, he said, half to himself. It's beautiful. But are you sure about this? I nodded, my hands in my coat pockets. I'm sure. This isn't about guilt anymore. It's the last thing I'll ever give them. Not out of duty, out of closure. He looked at me for a long moment. Closure's expensive. I can afford it. I smiled, small but steady. Inside, the air smelled of new paint and cedar. The hardwood floors glowed honey gold in the sunlight, and the kitchen had marble counters so pristine they reflected my face. I walked through each room slowly, imagining my mother opening the curtains. My father reading the paper on the porch, the boys running across the grass. This place feels peaceful, I said quietly. Jordan nodded. Peaceful's a good start. 2 weeks later, I met my parents in front of the same house. They were early, standing by the for sale sign, holding hands like they hadn't in years. My mother's eyes were red before I even said a word. Emily. She whispered, this can't be real. It's real, I said. It's yours. My father stepped forward, his voice thick. You didn't have to. I wanted to. I cut in gently. You said you needed a smaller place, something easier. So here it is. Mom brushed at her cheeks. I don't know what to say. Say yes, I told her, echoing my words from that night in Santa Barbara. When the realtor handed them the keys, my mother actually cried. My father shook my hand, his grip trembling. Thank you, sweetheart. I mean it. It was the first time he'd called me that since I was a child. We're going to throw a proper housewarming party, Mom declared, voice bright with excitement. Invite everyone who's ever helped us. It'll be beautiful. We'll do it for you. I smiled. That sounds nice. As we walked through the rooms together, she touched everything. Curtains, countertops, even the faucets. Like she couldn't believe it was real. This is something we never had, she said, her voice soft. Something we could be proud of. I'm glad, I said. You deserve that. Samantha arrived later with her phone already recording. Okay guys, this is it, she announced, sweeping the camera across the living room. The new Carter home, courtesy of my amazing sister Emily. I laughed awkwardly. Don't make it sound like a commercial. Too late, she said, still filming. People love a good family comeback story. The words didn't sit right, but I let them pass. That afternoon, I helped my mother pick curtains. She wanted soft linen in pale blue. It feels calm, she said. We went to a nursery in town and picked a young maple tree to plant in the front yard. Something that grows with us, she told me. When the gardener lowered the sapling into the ground, she stood beside me, her hand brushing mine. Thank you, Emily, she whispered. For everything. For the first time, I believed she meant it. That night, after everyone had gone inside, I stayed on the porch. The house was lit from within, golden windows, laughter faint behind the glass. My father's voice rumbled somewhere in the background. The twins giggled upstairs, and my mother hummed in the kitchen as she unpacked dishes. The breeze carried the scent of jasmine and fresh-cut grass. I leaned against the railing and let the quiet settle around me. For a long time I'd thought I'd never belong anywhere. But standing there, hearing their laughter in a home I'd given them, I felt something close to peace. Maybe finally I'd built a bridge over the years of silence. Jordan texted me a photo of the signed documents. "Everything's finalized. Congratulations." I stared at it for a moment, then typed back, "After the party, I'll transfer the deed." He replied, "You sure you want to?" "Yes," I wrote. "This house should be theirs. I've carried enough of the past." I slipped my phone back into my pocket, listening to the low hum of crickets, the ocean far away. Inside, the lights flickered once, as if the house was breathing for the first time. I watched the little maple tree sway in the wind, fragile but rooted, and whispered, "We're both starting over." The night air grew cooler, but I didn't move. For the first time since childhood, I didn't feel like an outsider looking in. I was part of something I'd built with my own hands. The porch light glowed steady, the windows warm, and I told myself this was what family was supposed to feel like, even if it had taken me half a lifetime to find it. It had been almost a month since I handed my parents the keys to their new house, and they still hadn't mentioned anything about the housewarming party they'd promised. Every time I called, my mother had a new excuse. "We're still getting settled," she'd say. "Your father wants everything to be perfect. Don't worry, sweetheart. We'll let you know when it's time." At first, I believed her. I was buried in work anyway, juggling end-of-quarter reports and late-night calls with clients in London. The days blurred together until one Wednesday morning when an email popped up in my inbox. It was from Tom Willis, the retired neighbor who used to live across the street from my parents. His message was short, almost cheerful. "Congratulations to your mom and dad on their big party this Saturday. I didn't know you'd be back in town. Hope to see you there." I reread the email twice, my hand frozen above the keyboard. "What party?" I called him right away. "Hi, Tom. It's Emily. I just got your email. What party are you talking about?" There was a pause on the other end, then his friendly laugh. "The housewarming, of course. Your parents invited everyone. Whole neighborhood's talking about it. They even hired a jazz band." "You must be so proud of them." I pressed my fingers to my forehead. "Right, of course. Thanks for letting me know." When I hung up, my pulse was thudding in my ears. I opened Facebook. My stomach twisting as I typed in my sister's name. Her page loaded instantly, public, curated, glossy as ever. The first post at the top stopped me cold. "Can't wait for Mom and Dad's housewarming party this weekend. 120 guests, the most beautiful house in Montecito. It's going to be the event of the year." Beneath it were dozens of comments, congratulations, heart emojis, people asking for the address. There were photos, too, tables being set up on the lawn, fairy lights strung along the porch, catering vans parked in the driveway. My throat went dry. I scrolled through the pictures one after another, as if the next might somehow make sense of it. My mother's face was in one smiling wide, holding a glass of wine, while a decorator arranged flowers behind her. Samantha had captioned it, "Mom's dream finally came true. No mention of me." I sat there for a long time staring at the screen. Then I took a breath, opened a new email and typed, "Subject, housewarming party. Hi, Mom. Just wondering when the party is. Would love to make sure I can get time off work to come." I hit send. An hour passed, then 2, no reply. By evening, I picked up the phone and called. It rang 6 times before she answered. "Emily." Her voice was syrupy sweet. "How are you, honey?" "I'm fine," I said evenly. "Just checking about the party. Tom mentioned it's this weekend." "Oh, that." She let out a soft laugh. No, we're still planning. Probably a few weeks from now. You know how these things go, so much coordination." I waited for her to continue, but she didn't. I could hear music and voices in the background, laughter dishes clinking. "Right," I said quietly. "Of course. You'll let me know." "Absolutely," she said. "Love you, sweetheart." When the line went dead, I stared at the phone, my jaw tightening. I opened a chat with Jordan. "They're lying to me," he replied almost immediately. "What makes you think that?" Because my mother's voice shakes when she lies, and she sounded like she was standing in the middle of a dinner party while telling me there isn't one. Jordan called instead of texting back. "Take a breath," he said as soon as I answered. "If you're right, you need proof. Don't confront them until you know for sure. How do I get proof when they've already erased me?" He was silent for a moment. Find someone who hasn't. After we hung up, I scrolled through my contacts until I reached Tom's name again. I hesitated, then typed a message. "Hey, Tom, random question. Could you send me a picture of the decorations for the party? I'd love to see how everything looks." A minute later, he replied with a thumbs up. Then I waited. An hour crawled by. I tried to distract myself with work, but I couldn't focus. When my phone finally buzzed, my stomach clenched. Tom had sent 6 photos. The first showed the front yard lit up with fairy lights, tables covered in white linens, and a banner that read, "Welcome to the Carters' dream home." The next was a catering crew unloading champagne glasses. The last one caught my mother mid-laugh, standing next to Samantha and a group of guests, people from our old church, old neighbors' faces I recognized from childhood. They were all there, everyone but me. My hand shook so hard I almost dropped the phone. I scrolled back up to Samantha's post, reading it again and again until the words blurred. The event of the year. I felt something deep and familiar claw up my chest. The same hollow ache I'd felt as a teenager when I realized my parents would always choose her over me. Only this time, it wasn't just dinner. It was my gift. My house. I pushed away from my desk, pacing. The city lights outside shimmered against the glass. Jordan texted, "You okay?" I typed back. "No, but I know what I'm going to do." He called again, but I didn't answer. I went to the closet, pulled out the folder that held the property deed, the receipts, the wire transfer records, every document that proved the house was legally mine. I placed them neatly into my leather bag. As I zipped it shut, I caught my reflection in the mirror, calm, composed, cold. I turned off the lights in my apartment and stood by the window for a moment, watching the skyline glow. When they had ignored me as a kid, I'd cried. When they dismissed me as an adult, I'd worked harder. But this was different. They had erased me from my own story. I opened my laptop and booked a flight to California for the next morning. Then I picked up my phone and sent one last message to Jordan. They want a show. Then I'll give them an ending worth watching. The message sent. The city outside buzzed softly. Indifferent as ever, I slipped the bag over my shoulder, sat down on the edge of the bed, and let the anger cool into something sharper. By morning, I would be on a plane. And by Saturday night, they'd remember exactly who I was. The sun was sinking low over Montecito, that honey-colored light, draping itself across the driveways and palm trees, like something out of a magazine. I parked the rental car a block away, engine still running for a moment as I tried to steady my breathing. The air was thick with the faint scent of salt and champagne. Through the windshield, I could see it. The house. My house. The one I bought for them. Gold balloons arched over the gate, spelling out the Carter family's dream home. Cars lined both sides of the street, sleek, expensive, spotless. Somewhere inside, jazz music played soft but rhythmic laughter spilling out between songs. I turned off the engine. For a moment, I just sat there, hands tight on the steering wheel, watching my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked calm. Too calm. My hair was tied up in a neat bun, my black dress simple and unassuming. I wanted to look like I belonged anywhere, and nowhere. When I stepped out, the sound of music hit me full force. A saxophone, distant conversation, the clinking of glasses. It wasn't just a gathering. It was a performance. I walked closer, staying behind a couple arriving late. The man at the gate, a hired valet, in a crisp white shirt, smiled at me. "Evening, ma'am. You're a guest of the family." I met, his eyes steady. "You could say that." He nodded and opened the gate. Inside, the backyard had been transformed into something out of a lifestyle magazine. Rows of tables glimmered under strings of lights. A jazz trio played near the pool, and servers in black vests carried trays of hors d'oeuvres. I recognized half the faces, neighbors from Santa Barbara, distant relatives I hadn't seen since high school. Even a few of my father's old law firm colleagues. And then there she was. Samantha. She stood near the center of the crowd, flawless as always. Hair perfectly curled, champagne in hand, her phone raised as she live-streamed. "And here they are," she announced into the camera. "Mom and Dad, finally homeowners again. Hard work pays off." The crowd laughed and applauded. My stomach tightened. My father took the microphone from her, smiling wide. "We've worked our whole lives for this moment," he said, voice warm, steady. "And we're so grateful, especially to Sam, who helped make this possible." Applause again. Cameras flashed. My mother dabbed at her eyes, pretending to cry. I felt the world tilt slightly beneath me. The noise, the light, the applause, it all blurred for a moment into a low, humming static. My father continued. "Family means everything, doesn't it? We wouldn't be here without love and perseverance." He raised his glass. To new beginnings, I could have screamed. Instead, I inhaled slowly, let the air settle in my chest, and began to walk. As I moved closer, conversations softened. One by one, heads began to turn. I saw recognition flicker across faces, first confusion, then shock. Samantha froze mid-sentence, her phone still raised but her smile faltering. "Emily," she said, voice higher than usual. I stopped just inside the crowd, my heels clicking softly against the stone path. The laughter died instantly. My mother recovered first. She moved toward me, a strained smile stretching her lips. "Oh, sweetheart, you made it." "What a surprise, we didn't think you could come." I looked at her. "I wasn't invited." Her smile twitched. "That's nonsense. You must have missed the message." There was no message. My voice was calm, but I could feel my pulse in my throat. Funny how everyone else seemed to get one. My father stepped forward, chuckling awkwardly. "Let's not do this here, Emily. This is a celebration." I let my eyes sweep across the guests. Faces, pretending to sip their drinks, phones hovering midair. "Oh, I can see that," I said. "A real celebration. Champagne, music, perfect lighting. Only missing one thing, though." A woman I didn't recognize leaned toward my mother, whispering something. I caught a fragment. "Isn't that her daughter?" My mother's shoulders stiffened. She forced a laugh. Yes, just a small misunderstanding. You know how family things can be." I turned to the woman and smiled. "No misunderstanding," I said softly. "It's exactly what it looks like." For a moment, no one spoke. The jazz band, sensing the tension, slowed to a hesitant stop. Even the twins, Samantha's boys, peeked out from behind a table, wide-eyed. Samantha finally found her voice. "Emily, maybe we should talk privately." "No," I said. "You've had your stage. Let's keep the spotlight where it belongs." My mother reached for my arm, whispering harshly, "Don't embarrass us." I met her eyes. "You already did that for me." She flinched, but I pulled my arm away before she could answer. The silence stretched until even the cicadas outside seemed to stop buzzing. Then, without waiting for anyone to react, I started walking toward the house. Each step felt deliberate, heavy. Behind me, I could hear the murmurs. Questions, half-finished whispers, my name passed like a rumor. At the door, I turned back once more. My father stood frozen with his drink. My mother's smile trembling. Samantha's phone still recording her live stream, running silently now. I said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Nice party." Shame the guest list was so selective. Someone near the back let out a nervous laugh, but it died quickly. I didn't wait for an answer. I pushed open the door and stepped inside the house. The air inside was cooler, quieter. My heels echoed on the hardwood floors I'd picked out myself. The smell of new paint mixed with the faint sweetness of roses from the arrangements on every table. I stopped in the middle of the living room and looked around. Every corner, every detail. The marble countertops, the curtains, even the potted maple outside. I had chosen all of it. Now it belonged to people who had erased me. The chatter outside grew louder again, voices rising like a wave. I could almost hear my mother trying to explain it away, my sister smiling for the camera, my father pretending nothing was wrong. But I stayed where I was, my hand resting lightly on the kitchen counter, my heartbeat steady. Let them have their party. For now. The moment I turned back toward the living room, my parents were already moving toward me. My mother's heels clicked fast against the floor, her smile stretched thin. My father followed his voice, low warning. "Emily," he said through his teeth, "don't make a scene. Not here." I stopped in the doorway, surrounded by the smell of wine and perfume, the hum of whispers from people pretending not to watch. A scene, I said quietly. You mean the truth? Mom's eyes darted toward the guests behind me. Please lower your voice. You're going to embarrass us. I took a step closer. You already did that when you lied to everyone about this house. She froze. The fake smile vanished. This is our home. We worked for it. I laughed once, sharp and humorless. Worked for it. You mean when you called me crying about losing your savings? Or when you let me pay every dime because you said you wanted a fresh start? Her hand tightened around my arm. This is our party, she whispered. Ours, not yours. Don't ruin it. I looked at her hand, then at her face. You can't ruin what's already rotten. Before she could respond, Samantha appeared, glittering in gold sequins, the same phone still clutched in her manicured hand. Oh, for God's sake, she snapped. What's this about now? You always need attention, don't you? Emily. Can't stand not being in the spotlight for once. My father hissed, Sam, but she kept going. Why don't you grow up? You gave them the house great. Be proud of it. Why make it about you again? I felt the words hit me like stones, but they didn't break anything, not anymore. You're right, I said evenly. It's not about me. It's about the truth. A few guests had their phones raised now. I saw red recording lights in my periphery. Someone whispered, is this really happening? I set my bag down on the coffee table, unzipped it, and pulled out a manila folder. The noise in the room shifted, lower tense. You all keep saying this house is the Carter's dream, I said, unfolding the papers slowly. You're half right. It's a dream, all right, just not yours. Emily, my father said sharply. That's enough. No, I said. It's time. I held up the top page. This is the grant deed for this property. It's in my name. I bought this house. Every cent, $1.5 million. No loans, no cosigners, no tricks. The crowd murmured. Someone gasped. I was going to transfer it after tonight, I continued, because I thought this party was about family, not vanity. But it seems I was wrong. Samantha laughed, high-pitched and brittle. You're unbelievable. What, you printed fake documents to humiliate Mom and Dad? That's pathetic. My stomach twisted, but I didn't look at her. These aren't fake. Then a new voice came from the doorway. They're not. Every head turned. Jordan stepped inside, crisp suit, calm face. He held up a smaller envelope. Certified copies from the Santa Barbara County Recorder's Office, he said. Legally verified this afternoon. My mother's face drained of color. You brought a lawyer? No, I said. I brought a witness. A ripple went through the crowd. Someone near the back whispered, Is this on camera? And another voice answered, It's streaming live, I think. Samantha blinked, streaming. The woman with the bright red dress near the fireplace held up her phone. I'm live on Facebook. People are asking if this is real. Turn that off. My father barked, but it was too late. The crowd was alive now. Whispers, phones, flashes. The air was thick with curiosity and discomfort. My mother's voice rose desperate. Emily, you can't do this. We're family. Family, I said. Family doesn't lie about who gave them a roof over their heads. Her eyes filled with tears. You're humiliating us in front of everyone. No, I said softly. You did that the moment you pretended this house was yours. For a second, everything stilled. The air, the guests, even the jazz band outside that had stopped playing. Then Samantha tried to laugh. Come on, everyone, relax. She's joking, right? Emily loves to make things dramatic. It's like a little prank, but nobody laughed. Dozens of eyes were fixed on me, on the papers, on the truth unfolding in front of them. I folded the deed carefully and slipped it back into my bag. This party's over, I said. My mother gasped. You can't. I can. I interrupted, lifting my chin, because this is my house, and you're all standing in it. Silence, only the sound of glass touching glass as someone set down a drink too quickly. I'd appreciate it if everyone left. I added my voice even clear. Now, for a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, a few guests began gathering their things, muttering awkward goodbyes. Someone said, I think we should go, and others followed. The shuffle of footsteps filled the room. The band outside started packing up their instruments. A server carried a tray toward the kitchen, eyes down. Samantha's mouth hung open, words caught somewhere between anger and disbelief. My father just stood there staring at the floor, the microphone still dangling from his hand. My mother sobbed quietly, wiping at her face, whispering, "How could you do this to us?" I turned toward the open doors. The night air poured in, cool, clean, sharp. I stepped onto the porch, my heels clicking against the wood. Behind me, I could still hear the murmurs fading into silence. The fairy lights glowed warm around the maple tree we'd planted together. I didn't cry. Not this time. I just breathed. For years, they had made me feel small in every room I entered. Tonight, I had taken that room back. The porch light flickered once, then steadied, washing my face in gold. I stayed there until the last car pulled away, and the house finally went quiet. By sunrise, the story had already gone viral. My phone buzzed nonstop. Calls, texts, notifications piling one after another. Every platform was the same headline plastered across different screens. Daughter uninvited to her parents' housewarming. But the house was hers. The video was everywhere. Someone at the party had streamed the entire thing, and overnight it spread like wildfire. The clip of me holding up the deed had been replayed, captioned slowed down, turned into memes, then into hashtags. Hashtag family lies. Hashtag real daughter revenge. By 9 The story had reached talk shows. One host leaned forward over her coffee mug and said, "I mean, this is the ultimate betrayal. Imagine buying your parents a house and getting banned from the party." The other replied, "You can't make this stuff up. She's my hero." The comments under the video were brutal, and not for me. She gave them everything, and they erased her. Typical narcissistic parents. This is what happens when the quiet kid finally snaps. I should have felt vindicated, but watching it unfold made me feel hollow. By noon, the fallout started. Samantha's brand partnerships, 2 fashion labels and a skincare company, cut ties with her. Her social media comments turned toxic. My father's old law firm released a statement that he had voluntarily stepped away from the Montecito Bar Association. And my mother's name quietly disappeared from the member list of the Women's Circle of Montecito. My inbox flooded with journalists asking for statements. Podcast producers inviting me to share my truth. I ignored all of them. At Horizon Capital, whispers followed me as I walked through the lobby. By the time I reached my desk, 2 interns were huddled over their phones watching the video. They froze when I passed. I didn't blame them. A few minutes later, Michael Torres stepped out of his office and called my name. I stood in the doorway as he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. On his desk, his iPad was paused on a still image of me from the video. Standing in the middle of the crowd, face calm, eyes cold. "I saw it," he said simply. I waited. He nodded toward the screen. "You know what that is?" I exhaled slowly. "A mess." He smiled faintly. "No, that's control. That's power. You didn't raise your voice, you didn't flinch, and you didn't lie. You handled it better than half the executives I've seen in crisis mode. I didn't know what to say. You taught me something," he added, closing the tablet. "Justice doesn't have to be loud." I managed a small smile. "I didn't do it to teach anyone." He nodded almost respectfully. "Still, it's good to see someone stand their ground and stay human." When I left his office, the whispers stopped. Not because they forgot, but because people tend to go quiet when they realize who they're talking about. By late afternoon, I thought maybe, just maybe it was over. Then Jordan called. His voice was tight, formal. "Emily, I just got word from the courthouse." My stomach dropped. "What now?" "Your father filed a complaint. He's suing you." I closed my eyes, leaning against the cool glass wall of the conference room. "For what?" "According to the paperwork," Jordan said, "he's claiming the house was purchased with family money. Joint funds. That you promised to sign it over, and then betrayed the agreement. He's arguing implied ownership." I laughed, once a dry sound. "He's unbelievable, Emily." "Listen," Jordan said. "They want to turn this around, to paint you as ungrateful, vindictive. It's classic projection. But we'll fight it. I know." He paused. "You okay?" "I'm tired," I admitted. "I thought this was done." "It will be," he said. "Let me handle the paperwork. Don't talk to the press. Don't post anything. Stay steady." After we hung up, I went home and poured myself a glass of wine I didn't drink. The city lights blinked through my windows, indifferent as always. The articles shifted tone by evening. Some focused on the Carter lawsuit, spinning it like a family tragedy, not a betrayal. My parents' lawyer released a statement. The Carters only seek fairness after a misunderstanding within the family. Misunderstanding. That word again. It made my skin crawl. I stood on my balcony watching the traffic far below. The wind off the Hudson was sharp, tugging at my hair. For the first time in weeks, I let myself breathe without pretending. I thought about my mother's voice that night, how it shook, how she said, "We're family," like it was a threat instead of a promise. They'd always rewritten the story to make me the problem. This time I wasn't giving them the pen. Somewhere behind me, my phone buzzed again. A new notification, another news headline. Carter family scandal deepens as parents. Sue daughter. Over $1.5 million home. I almost laughed. They were really doing it. I looked out at the skyline, its lights shimmering like distant stars, and let the anger drain into something quieter. Something stronger. I whispered to no one but the night air. I thought it was over. But I guess justice doesn't come easy. The city wind carried the words away, scattering them into the hum of sirens and life below. Somewhere out there, people were watching my story unfold, turning it into entertainment. But I knew what it really was. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about being seen, finally and truthfully. And I wasn't done yet. May 2024 arrived gray and heavy, the kind of morning that felt too quiet for what was about to happen. The courthouse in downtown Santa Barbara was already surrounded by cameras when Jordan and I pulled into the parking lot. Photographers clustered near the steps, microphones like weapons aimed toward the doors. Someone shouted my name and flashes burst in the misty air. I kept walking head high, gray coat buttoned tight. Jordan leaned close as we reached the marble steps. "Don't react," he murmured. "They want a headline, not the truth." Inside the courthouse smelled faintly of dust and coffee. We passed through security, then into the courtroom, a room full of wood echo and eyes. My parents were already there, seated at the opposite table. My father in a dark suit, hands clasped tightly. My mother in pale blue, her makeup carefully done, but her expression hollow. Samantha sat behind them. Sunglasses perched on her head like armor. When I entered, my mother looked up. For a second, I thought I saw the smallest flicker of regret. Then it was gone. The bailiff called the session to order. Case number 24-1637, Carter versus Carter. The words sounded absurd even to me. My father's attorney, a man with a too-perfect tie, stood. "Your Honor, my clients simply seek justice within their family. This house, though purchased under Ms. Carter's name, was intended as a gift, a gesture of love. Our clients relied on that promise. They merely ask that fairness be restored." I stared down at the table, jaw tight. Love, fairness. They'd learned to twist those words better than anyone. Jordan rose slowly. His voice was steady, measured. "Your Honor. The defense submits into evidence Exhibit A, the signed purchase contract from Montecito Realty showing Ms. Carter as sole buyer. Exhibit B, the wire transfer records from her personal account. Exhibit C, the email correspondence between Ms. Carter and the seller confirming no co-buyer or co-financier." He laid each folder down one by one. The sound echoed in the quiet room. The judge. Karen Fields, stern and composed with silver hair and clear blue eyes, adjusted her glasses. "Continue." Jordan nodded. "This is not a case of misunderstanding, Your Honor. It's a case of exploitation. Ms. Carter purchased the home outright with her own funds as a gift without legal or written obligation. The plaintiff's claim relies entirely on verbal assumptions." My father slammed his palm against the table. "She told us it was ours. She said she'd give it to us." The judge turned her gaze to him. "Mr. Carter, please control yourself." He stood anyway. Red creeping up his neck. "We believed her. She's our daughter. We trusted her." Jordan didn't flinch. "Your Honor, belief is not ownership. Trust is not title." A murmur rippled through the spectators' bench. The judge raised her hand. "Order." I looked at my parents, then really looked at them. My father's eyes were bloodshot, a mix of anger and shame. My mother's hands trembled in her lap. For a fleeting second, I wanted to feel sorry for them. But pity was dangerous. It was how they'd always pulled me back in. Judge Fields turned to me. "Ms. Carter, would you like to speak?" I stood my knees steady. The room seemed to contract around me. The air electric. I bought that house. I said, my voice clear. Not for status, not for pride, but because I thought they needed help. I believed doing something good might fix what was broken between us. I was wrong. I learned that generosity means nothing when it's given to people who only see it as debt. The judge watched me unreadable. My mother began to cry quietly. I continued softer. I didn't buy the house because they were worthy. I bought it because I still thought they could love me back. The silence afterward was so complete, I could hear the hum of the ceiling lights. Judge Fields straightened her gavel, resting lightly on the bench. The court finds the deed, the financial documents, and correspondence all support Ms. Carter's sole ownership. The plaintiff's case is based on unsubstantiated claims. Therefore, this court rules in favor of the defendant. She tapped the gavel once. All legal ownership of the property at 1726 Oak Ridge Drive remains with Ms. Emily Carter. Case dismissed. The sound of the gavel cracked like thunder in the stillness. My father sank back into his chair, color draining from his face. My mother turned away, tears streaking her makeup. Samantha looked stunned, her phone slipping from her hand. Jordan gathered the papers, sliding them neatly into his briefcase. "It's over," he whispered. But as we left the courtroom, the noise outside was waiting. The reporters swarmed as soon as the doors opened. Ms. Carter, Ms. Carter, how does it feel to win against your parents? Emily, are you planning to reconcile? Do you regret what happened? I stopped on the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed, microphones pushed forward. For a moment, I thought about walking away. Then one reporter shouted above the rest, "Do you have any regrets at all?" I turned, looked straight into the camera lens, and said, "Only one. I regret ever believing that family loyalty could be bought with hope." The crowd went silent for half a heartbeat, then erupted. The flashes flared again, voices overlapping the world, recording every word. Jordan's hand brushed my elbow, guiding me toward the car. "Let's go," he said quietly. We drove through downtown in silence. The ocean glimmered at the edge of the highway, calm and endless. That night, my words made headlines again. Every news outlet replayed the clip of me standing on the courthouse steps, the quote printed across their screens in bold. They called it revenge with grace, but I didn't feel vengeful, just free. For the first time, I felt like the noise around me could finally fade. Justice didn't roar, it whispered, and that whisper was enough. After the court ruling, everything went quiet in a way I hadn't expected. No reporters camped outside my building, no more calls from morning shows, wanting me to share my story. Even the comments online started to slow, buried under newer scandals. The noise faded, and all that was left was silence. My parents moved out of Montecito 2 weeks later. They didn't tell me, but the property manager called to confirm they'd collected their things. Someone said they rented a small apartment in Ventura, near the harbor. I didn't check. Samantha left town soon after her influencer career collapsing under the weight of her own reputation. Her followers turned on her brands, stopped calling, and she quietly deleted her social media accounts. For the first time in my life, no one in the Carter family was performing for an audience. One morning in July, I found a letter in my mailbox. No return address, just my name written in a familiar hand. I stood in the hallway for a minute before opening it. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, like it had been rewritten several times. "Emily, you've made your point. We've lost everything. Our friends, our standing, the life we built. You might have won your case, but you destroyed your family in the process. I hope it was worth it. Mom." I read it twice. The ink smudged slightly near the bottom, maybe from her tears, maybe from mine. For a long time, I didn't move. Then I folded it carefully, slipped it back into the envelope, and placed it in the kitchen drawer with the rest of the things I didn't need to hold on to, but couldn't throw away. I wasn't angry, just tired. They still didn't understand. That weekend, I drove up the coast to visit Eleanor Brooks at the nursing home in San Luis Obispo. She was 84 now, thinner, but still sharp as glass. Her room smelled faintly of lavender and paper. When she saw me, her eyes lit up. "There's my troublemaker," she said, smiling. I laughed. "More like your case study in human disappointment." She motioned for me to sit beside her. "You look different, lighter." I thought about it. Maybe because I finally stopped trying to fix people who don't want to be fixed. Eleanor nodded slowly. "So are you at peace for the first time?" I said. "It doesn't feel like victory, though. Just release." Her hand found mine, frail but warm. "Then you've won, sweetheart. Winning isn't about revenge. It's about sleeping through the night without ghosts shaking you awake. I smiled. You should have been a poet instead of an economist. I've lived long enough to know both deal in value, she said, laughing softly. Just different kinds. When I left, she hugged me longer than usual. Don't carry their mistakes any further than the parking lot, she whispered. On the drive back, the coastline unfolded beside me. Cliffs, sea spray, sunlight rippling on the water. Somewhere between San Luis Obispo and Santa Barbara, I realized she was right. The anger had burned itself out. All that was left was clarity. A few days later, I returned to Montecito one last time. The house sat empty, echoing with a silence that felt too big for its walls. Dust covered the marble counters, and the faint scent of my mother's perfume lingered in the curtains. I wandered through each room, touching the banister. The kitchen island, the spot on the living room floor where the maple tree's shadow used to fall. In the corner of the dining room, I found a small dent in the baseboard. One of the twins had crashed a toy car there during their first visit. For some reason, that mark hit me harder than anything else. Proof that I had tried to give them something lasting, something safe. I sat down on the bare floor, cross-legged, the sun streaming through the tall windows. Dust motes floated in the light, slow and aimless. I bought this house to bring us together, I said quietly, though no one was there to hear it. Turns out it was the only way to set myself free. The realtor arrived shortly after, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes. It's a beautiful property, she said. You'll have no trouble selling, I know. I replied, let's make it quick. By the end of the week, the sale papers were ready. I signed them in her office, my name looping across the page in steady ink. The check felt heavy in my hand, not because of the amount, but because of what it represented. A closed circle, an ending without applause. That night, I sat in my apartment in New York and opened my laptop. The California Women's Fund, a nonprofit Eleanor had once told me about, flashed on the screen. Their current campaign was raising money for women recovering from emotional and financial abuse. Without thinking too hard, I transferred $200,000 from the house sale into their donation portal. When the confirmations appeared, I felt the smallest smile pull at my lips. I didn't owe anyone an explanation. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't redemption either. It was balance. A way to return the same energy my parents had given me. Pain silence manipulation, and turn it into something gentler, something that didn't wound anymore. Outside, the city glowed under a soft rain. I pressed my forehead against the cool window pane, watching the drops race each other down the glass. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was looking back at what I'd lost. I was watching what I'd built finally stand on its own. A year later, I turned 36, and New York felt different. Quieter, softer, as if the city and I had finally made peace with each other. The skyline outside my office glimmered under the early light, the Hudson catching streaks of silver. I sat by the window of my corner office at Horizon Capital, the hum of the city faint beneath the glass. It was a normal morning. Until Jordan knocked. He stepped inside holding a thick envelope, his tie slightly loose as usual. "Guess what just came through," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "Good news or more paperwork?" "Both," he replied, smiling as he set it on my desk. "The court officially closed the Carter case this morning. The file's sealed. No appeal, no reopening." I looked at the envelope for a moment before picking it up. It was heavier than it should have been. "So that's it," I said quietly. Jordan nodded. "That's it." I placed it gently back on the desk and exhaled. "Then it's over." He studied me for a moment. "You know," he said, "you've become something of an icon. Half the people in this building saw your interview last year. My sister says you're her favorite story on #RealJustice. I laughed softly. "I never asked to be anyone's symbol." He smiled. "Maybe not, but the best ones never do." When he left, I turned my chair toward the window again. The Hudson shimmered below sunlight, reflecting off its surface like scattered coins. My computer chimed, breaking the stillness. A new email flashed across the screen, from the California Women's Fund. "Dear Ms. Carter, thanks to your continued contributions, 50 women and their children have been provided safe housing counseling and legal aid this year. Your generosity continues to change lives." I leaned back, reading it twice. 50 women, 50 different versions of a story like mine. Some still fighting, some already free. My chest tightened, but it wasn't pain this time. It was something gentler. The office was quiet, except for the soft hum of the HVAC and the distant sound of phones ringing down the hall. I closed my eyes for a second and let the silence fill me. I thought of everything that had brought me here, the cold dinners in Santa Barbara, the endless chores, the letters that never said I'm proud of you. I thought of my grandparents' warmth, of Eleanor's wisdom of the night. I stood before 120 people and finally said, "This is my house." That moment had once defined me. Now it just lived in the past like an old photograph, sharp, real, but no longer burning. I opened my notebook, the same one I'd carried since Stanford. On the last page, I wrote 3 words I kept going. It wasn't poetic. It was enough. Outside, the day brightened. I stood and walked to the glass doors that led to the small terrace off my office. The wind off the river was cool, carrying that faint, salty smell that reminded me of home. I rested my hands on the railing, watching the ferries glide below tiny white wakes trailing behind them. My phone buzzed on the desk inside. When I checked it, a notification blinked across the screen. "Your story just hit 1 million views." I smiled, the kind of smile that came from deep inside. The world had watched, judged, cried, applauded, but none of that mattered now. What mattered was that I had survived my own story. They could have my childhood, my silence, my mistakes, but not my dignity. Never again. The wind tugged at my hair, the city breathing around me. I thought of what Eleanor had said that day in the nursing home. Winning wasn't revenge. It was peace. I turned back toward my desk, ready to close the file for good. But before I did, I whispered the words that had stayed with me through everything. I used to think love meant forgiving without boundaries. Now I know love begins when you finally set them. The phone buzzed again. This time a message from Jordan. "Dinner later." "You owe me one celebration," I typed back. "You handled the law. I handled the truth. Fair trade." Then I turned off my computer, letting the screens fade to black. The sun had climbed higher now, cutting through the glass and spilling light across the floor. I stepped back out to the balcony, letting the warmth touch my face. Somewhere behind me, the city went on with its noise. Cars honking, people rushing, life continuing, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. And maybe that was the point. Life did continue. Even after betrayal. Even after loss. Especially after freedom. I looked toward the sky, blue and endless. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel small beneath it. If anyone out there is still trapped in someone else's version of love, someone who makes you believe silence is loyalty or pain is family, remember this. Justice isn't about revenge. It isn't about making them see what they did. It's about standing tall even when your voice shakes. It's about letting the truth speak for itself. And it's about walking forward without looking back.